Hi everyone, my name is Ryan Estrellado and I am the author of the K-12 Educator's Data Guidebook, Reimagining Practical Data Use in Schools. If you're watching this video, you're probably participating in the virtual book club for the K-12 Educator's Data Guidebook. And in this video, we are going to be discussing an idea from Chapter 9, which is all about data questions. If you're new to the virtual book club, do go into the notes and watch the Chapter 3 video. In that video, I've got an introduction about my background and why I wrote the book. Okay, so in this chapter, we are going to talk about why good data questions are important for when we learn how to use data practically in our education jobs. In my experience working in schools, we often get data just on its own with very little context. It might be from end-of-year testing requirements. It could be from a data report that comes out of instructional software that we use. But what can be missing from that process is some time to reflect on why we are collecting the data in the first place. But what are the questions that, if we answer them well, would help us make the kinds of decisions that would make school productive and positive for the students who attend them? Okay, so let's start with a common definition for what a good data question is. In the book, I define 3 qualities of what I think makes a data question good. The first one is the question is directly related to your job duties in schools. It's completely relevant to what it is that you do, whether that be being a principal, a teacher, or a school psychologist, or another kind of service provider. The second quality of a good data question is that it has the right amount of detail. I'll talk a little bit more about this later in the video, but we're looking for the Goldilocks spot of detail in your data question. Not too much, not too little, and there's a great reason for this. Stay tuned, we'll talk about that in a little bit. And then finally, is your data question set up so that you answer it on the right time horizon for the problem that you are trying to solve? Okay, so let me give you an example of what I think is a pretty good data question. Let's pretend that you are a principal in a school and you are interested in learning more about the state of attendance in the school where your community attends. A good data question could be something like, what is the general state of attendance in our school? Okay, so I think that question is pretty good. As you'll see later in the video, there are some other things that we can do to tune it and make it even better. But I wanted to give you an example of just how practical that could be. So let's go through the qualities of a good data question one more time and see if this question meets those requirements. Number 1, is the data question relevant for the educator's job? The question in general, what is the state of attendance at our school, goes directly to the principal's responsibility to create a positive school experience for students. The second criteria, does it have the sufficient amount of detail to answer the question well? This one's a little trickier and we're going to dive into it a little later on in the video, but for now, I would summarize by saying yes. It's broad enough that we'll have to look at a number of different sources of data, but it's also a narrow enough topic that it forces us to focus on attendance-related data. And then finally, is this question answerable on the right timeline? Generally speaking, I'd say yes, attendance data comes in as quickly as daily, but it can also be aggregated so you can look at it on a weekly basis or a monthly basis. So depending on the kind of strategy that the principal in this imaginary scenario is trying to build, they'll have to be careful about what kind of data they pick. Longer term strategies will require more data. On the other hand, if the principal wants to test daily strategies, then they'll need daily attendance to see how well those ideas are working out. Okay, so I want to take a little bit of time to dig into the second criteria, which is, does the question have sufficient detail to help you answer it in a meaningful way for students? This can get a little tricky, and so let me tell you what I mean by sufficient detail. Earlier, I mentioned something that I think about as the Goldilocks level of detail, which is not too much and not too little. I think it'll be helpful to look at examples of what too much detail could look like and what too little detail could look like. So imagine if the attendance data question that we were looking at was not what is the general state of attendance at our school, but rather something like how were students feeling about school? That kind of question is way too broad for what our imaginary principle is trying to solve here, which is understanding how to improve attendance. And if you game that scenario out and you collected all kinds of data that spoke to whether or not students were happy at school or how they were feeling about school, you might get some attendance data, but you would also get a lot of other things that may or may not connect to the problem that you're actually trying to solve, which is improving attendance. So let's swing the pendulum out in the other direction and look at a version of this question that is too detailed. What if that question was, what is the daily attendance count for every day of this week? Now, you're probably thinking, that's an actually relevant question if you're trying to improve attendance, and I agree. Here's the problem with that question is if you stop there, then you run the risk of missing a lot of other interesting data that can inform what your next step is to improve this situation, which is the perfect segue to return to the Goldilocks version of this question, which is what is the general state of attendance at our school? I like this version because it's broad enough that we have to look at multiple sources of data. Not only quantitative data like your daily attendance data, but also qualitative sources like interviews with parents about what it's like to get their students to school, what's working for them that makes them feel successful, what gets in the way when their students aren't able to get to school. You might even look at attendance data that is publicly available for the whole district or for other schools as context for what's happening at your school. The question here is broad enough that you have to look at those things in order to answer it. But it's also detailed enough that it is clearly about attendance. So as you make a list of all of the possible data sources that you look at, cross the ones off that couldn't in some way inform the story of attendance at your school. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about before we end the video is the third criteria, which is a good data question is answerable on the right time horizon. Let me say what I mean by that. People who work in education work different jobs, and the decisions that they make happen on different time horizons. Most teachers that I spoke to when I was researching for the book said they need to make decisions on at least a daily basis, and in some cases as often as hourly. On the other hand, if you're somebody who works at a school district or at a county office, you may be making decisions that don't come to fruition until months or maybe even a year later. That is a completely different time horizon compared to a teacher, which is why a data set for somebody who works at the county or the district may not be relevant for a teacher who needs to be making those decisions every day or every week. So as you think about your data questions, give it some thought. How often do you make these decisions? And does your question map to the frequency of that decision along with the data? If you're making daily decisions, you need to have data that is going to come daily or at least close to daily. On the other hand, if you're making a decision that won't get acted on a year from now, you will need to aggregate a lot of data over that period of a year, but you'll probably be looking at averages over a yearly period. Some examples could work here. If you were a teacher, you might be making a decision like who is going to go into small groups this afternoon for small group instruction. And to answer that question, you may be looking at daily data like exit tickets. On the other hand, if you work at a school district, you may be asking a question like, how many preschool classrooms should we open in the next school year? To solve that problem, you might be looking at average class sizes from the last 5 years. Daily data is not required. In fact, it might be too much, but you do need data from a yearly time horizon. Something interesting I've discovered as I was researching for the K-12 Educators Data Guidebook is that there tends to be a rule of thumb about different time horizons and the data associated with it. What I noticed is that daily decisions that need daily data can usually be made with less formal data points. I heard stories from teachers who said that they would walk the classroom during classwork time and then scan through the work of students to make a decision about who was going into small group instruction later in the day. That's fairly informal, but could be very effective. Exit tickets is another less formal, but daily way to collect information for daily or maybe even weekly decisions. On the other hand, at a district or county level where you are making decisions that won't happen a year from now, you may need more formal sources of data, such as publicly available enrollment, aggregated data from the student system, and you might even need tools from statistics like averages and standard deviations to reduce the amount of uncertainty you have for a decision that happens a year from now. Okay, so those are some thoughts on what makes a good data question for education data use. Does it directly help you in your education job? Does it have the sufficient amount of detail to give you the answers you need to make good decisions? And then is it answerable on the time horizon that your specific education job requires? Okay, so that's the video on how to write a good data question. I'm Ryan Estrellado, the author of the K-12 Educators Data Guidebook, and I'll see you in the virtual book club chat. Bye-bye.